Reed Kingsley had just ended a 4-minute phone call. 4 minutes enough for a business partner of 10 years to realize he had exactly 48 hours to leave the city. Reed didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply spoke in a flat, measured tone. The kind of voice that anyone sitting across from Reed Kingsley understood meant there would be no second chance. Tate, his right-hand man, nodded and stepped out to carry it through. Reed set the phone on his desk, stood, and walked into the second-floor hallway. Then he stopped. From below, a strange sound drifted up. Not the footsteps of security guards, not doors opening and closing. Laughter, children's laughter. Reed moved to the railing and looked down at the living room on the first floor. Blythe, the daughter who had been silent as a shadow for as long as anyone could remember, was sitting on the floor, tilting sideways, laughing so hard she nearly fell over. Darcy was rolling across the carpet, arms wrapped around her stomach, legs kicking wildly. Between the two girls sat a woman Reed had never seen before, hair pulled back in a messy knot, sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding up one of Blythe's scribbled drawings, and reading out dialogue for the characters in a deep, exaggerated voice. She kept a straight face for exactly 3 seconds before cracking up herself. Blythe laughed along. Darcy rolled over one more time on the carpet, shrieking, "Do it again! Do it again!" Reed stood there, phone still in his hand. The man who had just erased a 10-year business relationship in 4 minutes of conversation was now frozen in a hallway, undone by the sound of his own daughters laughing. He tried to remember the last time Blythe had laughed like that. He couldn't. He tried to remember the last time he'd walked into that room and sat with his 2 children. He couldn't do that either. Tate returned, saw Reed standing motionless by the railing. He walked over, followed his boss's gaze. 2 little girls and a stranger, laughing their heads off downstairs. "What's her name?" Reed asked, eyes still fixed below. "Gemma Lawson, nanny candidate, background check cleared." A few seconds of silence. "Hire her." Tate looked at Reed. 10 years at this man's side, and not once had Reed hired anyone without a face-to-face meeting. Not once. Reed turned and walked away. But just before he rounded the corner into the hallway, he paused for one extra beat, catching Blythe's voice floating up small, but clear. "This time draw a cat too, Miss Gemma." Then he kept walking. Slower than usual. That was the first time Reed Kingsley ever laid eyes on Gemma Lawson, and the first time in 3 years that laughter echoed through the living room of that vast, silent estate. But this story doesn't begin with laughter. This story begins with 3 years of silence inside a house too large, around a man no one dared get close to, and 2 little girls who had forgotten what it felt like to have their father home. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it with someone you care about. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story, because the best one might be waiting for you in the next video. 3 years earlier, this mansion had once held the sound of footsteps running up the stairs every morning, voices calling back and forth between rooms, music playing from the speaker in the kitchen when dinner was being set out. 3 years earlier, this house had once been a home. Then Reed's wife died, under circumstances he'd never believed were accidental. The police concluded it was an accident. Reed didn't say anything to the police. He didn't need them. He had his own ways. But from that night on, something inside Reed Kingsley went dark. No one saw him cry. No one heard him speak his wife's name. He took down every photograph on the walls and put them away in a locked cabinet inside his private room. He moved into his study to sleep. The master bedroom was still there, with everything still in place, but the door was always closed. Blythe and Darcy had only been 2 years old then. They had no memory of their mother, only an emptiness they weren't old enough to name, but large enough to feel every day. Reed loved his 2 daughters. In his own way, he hired the best nannies money could buy. The girls' room had everything, from books to toys to the softest beds. Security guarded the house 24 hours a day, but Reed never sat down to eat with his children, never read to them before bedtime, never stepped into their room after 9 o'clock at night. He believed the world he lived in was too dangerous to let the children come close. Distance to Reed was protection. The first nanny lasted 8 months. The second, 6 months. The third, 4 months. The fourth had just resigned the week before. Each of them had a different reason. But Tate knew the real reason. No one could bear the atmosphere inside this house. The mansion covered thousands of square meters, but it felt heavy, as if the ceilings were low. Guards moved without making a sound. Doors opened and closed with security codes. Cameras watched every corner. No one spoke loudly. No one played music. Everyone who worked in Reed Kingsley's house understood one unspoken rule: the less attention you drew, the better. Blythe and Darcy grew up inside that rule. They were 5-year-old girls, but they behaved with the orderliness of adults. Blythe would sit and draw alone for hours in the family room, not speaking to anyone unless she was asked first. Darcy was livelier, but she'd learned not to run noisily through the house, not to call for her father when he was in his study, not to ask why he didn't eat dinner with them. They'd grown used to caregivers constantly changing. Every time someone new arrived, Blythe would glance at them, then lower her eyes and continue drawing. Darcy would look a little longer, but she wouldn't come closer. Both of them waited to see how long that person would last. Tate was the only one who dared remind Reed of the two little girls. Every evening, after giving his work report, Tate would add a few short sentences. Blythe drew more than she did last week. Darcy asked why no one cooks breakfast in our house. Reed listened, nodded, asked nothing more. Once, Tate said, the little girls need more than a nanny. Reed looked at Tate with cold eyes. Tate didn't repeat that sentence a second time. The Kingsley mansion had everything: security, comfort, staff. It lacked only one thing no amount of money could buy: the sound of people speaking to one another, like a family. Until Gemma Lawson walked through that door. Gemma Lawson arrived at the Kingsley mansion on a Monday morning, carrying a backpack and carrying no expectations at all. She knew very little about the place where she was about to work. The person who referred her had only said, "High pay, 2 5-year-old twins, and don't ask too many questions about the boss." The mansion gate opened after she stood in front of the camera for nearly 1 minute. A guard led her along the driveway without saying a word. Gemma walked over the stone-paved path, with perfectly trimmed lawns on both sides, and she realized the first thing that made her uncomfortable. It was too quiet. No birdsong, no sound of running water, no sound at all except her footsteps on the stone. Tate met her at the front door. He shook her hand briefly, introduced himself in exactly 1 sentence, then led her inside. Gemma looked around as they crossed the foyer. High ceilings, polished stone floors, chandeliers, everything expensive and so clean it looked like a showroom. But there were no family photographs on the walls, no children's shoes on the shoe rack, no messy drawings stuck to the refrigerator, no sign at all that 2 5-year-old children were living in this house. Gemma had worked as a pediatric nurse for 3 years before the hospital closed. She'd been inside enough homes, enough sick rooms, to know that wherever there were children, there had to be traces of mess, of noise, of life. This mansion had none of that. Tate led her to the family room on the first floor. This was the only room that seemed to be used. A large rug covered the center of the floor, a few books were arranged on a low shelf, and an open box of crayons sat on a small table. Blythe was sitting in the corner of the room, her head lowered as she drew on a sheet of white paper. The little girl didn't look up when Gemma came in. She didn't look up when Tate introduced her, saying, "This is Miss Gemma, who'll be staying with you two starting today." She didn't look up when Gemma said, "Hello, sweetheart." Blythe only kept dragging the crayon across the paper, slowly. As if the adults in this room didn't exist, Darcy was sitting on the sofa, hugging a pillow, watching Gemma with wide, round, unblinking eyes. The little girl wasn't afraid. She wasn't curious. She was only looking, with the gaze of a child who'd already seen too many people walk into this room and disappear after a few months. Darcy looked at Gemma for exactly 4 seconds, then turned back to hug her pillow, her eyes fixed on the window. Tate looked at Gemma as if he wanted to say, "I warned you," but he said nothing. He placed a sheet of paper with the girl's daily schedule on the table, gave her a few basic instructions about the rules of the house, then walked out. Gemma stood in the middle of the family room, alone with 2 children who didn't want to look at her face. The room was so silent she could hear Blythe's crayon rubbing against the paper. Any other nanny might have tried to break that silence. She might have sat down, smiled brightly, and asked, "What are you drawing?" in an overly cheerful voice. She might have brought candy, new toys, or some promise like, "We're going to have so much fun." Gemma did none of that. She set her backpack down in the corner of the room, walked over to Blythe, and sat on the floor beside her. She said nothing, asked nothing. She only sat there, and watched Blythe draw. Blythe was drawing a house. A red roof, blue windows, a sky with clouds. There were no people in the picture. Gemma looked at the drawing, then at the box of crayons on the table, then back at the picture. She didn't say, "That's so beautiful," or "Why don't you draw some people too?" She only sat still. Blythe continued drawing. But after a few minutes, the little girl turned the paper slightly toward Gemma. Just a little, just enough for her to see it more clearly. It wasn't an invitation. It was only not being pushed away. From the sofa, Darcy glanced over. She was still hugging the pillow, but her head had turned toward Gemma and Blythe, her eyes watching. Gemma understood then. She didn't need to win these two children over. She didn't need to please them, didn't need to impress them. She only needed to sit here long enough, quietly enough, patiently enough, until Blythe and Darcy believed she wouldn't disappear like the four people before her. For the first 2 weeks, Gemma didn't try to change anything. She woke up at 6 o'clock, went down to the kitchen, and made breakfast. Not an elaborate breakfast. Eggs, toast, a cup of warm milk. She set it on the table, then sat and waited. On the first day, Blythe and Darcy came down to the kitchen, saw the food on the table, looked at Gemma, then silently sat down in their chairs. No one said thank you. No one said, "It's good." Gemma didn't ask either. She sat and ate with them, drank her coffee, and let the silence exist naturally, exactly as it was. The second day was the same. The third day was the same. By the fourth day, Darcy sat down at the table and said, very softly, "Is there orange juice today, Miss Gemma?" Gemma nodded, poured a glass of orange juice, and set it in front of Darcy. She didn't say anything more. But that was the first sentence Darcy had spoken to her on her own. Gemma understood. Every sentence from the children was a brick. She mustn't rush to build. She kept the rhythm going. In the morning, she cooked. At noon, she let the girls play by themselves, sitting nearby but not interfering. In the afternoon, she read books in the family room. At night, she read stories before bedtime. Gemma read slowly, her voice even, without adding funny sounds or exaggerated expressions. She read as if she were telling the story to herself, and if the two little girls wanted to listen, they could listen. Blythe was the harder one to reach. She spoke little, spent most of her time drawing, and built an invisible wall around herself that Gemma could feel clearly. But Gemma didn't try to break that wall down. She sat beside Blythe every afternoon, watching her draw without commenting, without praising, without asking what it meant. She only sat there. By the end of the first week, Blythe finished a picture, looked at it, looked at Gemma, then pushed the sheet of paper toward her. She said nothing. Gemma picked it up and looked carefully. The picture showed a garden with flowers, butterflies, and in the right corner, a sleeping cat. Gemma looked at Blythe and said softly, "This cat is sleeping so well." Blythe didn't smile, but her eyes brightened a little. Only a little. But Gemma saw it. From that day on, every time Blythe finished drawing, she pushed the picture over for Gemma to see. Not every picture, but more and more with each passing day. Darcy was quicker. The little girl began sitting closer to Gemma on the sofa, began asking small questions. What color Gemma liked, whether Gemma knew how to draw, which room she slept in inside this house. By the second week, Darcy held Gemma's hand as they went upstairs to the bedroom. No explanation, no asking permission. She simply reached out, took Gemma's hand, and walked beside her up the stairs. Gemma held her hand back. Not too tightly, not letting go, just enough. Reed remained the same. Gemma hardly saw him. Sometimes she heard the study door close, footsteps in the second-floor hallway, very late at night, the sound of a car engine starting outside before dawn. He existed inside this house like a powerful shadow. But to the two children on the first floor, that shadow was almost invisible. One evening, Gemma finished reading the story and tucked Darcy in. She stood to turn off the light when Darcy caught her hand and pulled her back. The little girl looked up, her voice so small that Gemma had to lean down to hear it clearly. "Miss Gemma, are you going to stay?" Gemma stopped. She looked at Darcy, looked into those wide, round eyes, the eyes that had watched 4 people walk in one after another and then disappear from this room. She sat down on the edge of the bed, at the little girl's eye level. "I'll be here." Darcy didn't say anything more. She only held Gemma's hand a little tighter, then closed her eyes. Gemma sat there for a few more minutes, listening as Darcy's breathing slowly became steady, then looked over at Blythe's bed. The little girl had fallen asleep too, her hand still hugging the box of crayons. Gemma stood, stepped out of the room, and gently closed the door. She walked down the hallway, past the dark family room, past the empty kitchen, past the foyer where there wasn't a single soul in sight. This whole vast house was beautiful and complete, yet two little girls had to ask the new nanny whether she was going to stay. They didn't lack someone to care for them. They lacked someone who wouldn't disappear. They lacked their father. Gemma stood at the end of the hallway and looked up toward the second floor, where light still spilled through the crack beneath Reed's study door. She made a decision. She wouldn't be just a nanny. She would pull that man back to his daughters. She didn't know how yet, but she would do it. The next morning, Gemma found Tate in the first-floor hallway. He was checking the security schedule on his phone, and when he saw Gemma approaching, he looked up. Gemma didn't go in circles. The girls need their father. They don't need more toys. They don't need another nanny. They need their father. Tate looked at her and lowered his phone. He was silent for a moment, then shook his head slightly. You don't understand him. I've walked beside him for 10 years. There are things he doesn't change, and you shouldn't try. Gemma asked, have you tried telling him? Tate looked at her with the eyes of a man who had tried and failed. I did. Once. He looked at me in a way I don't want to see a second time, and I didn't bring it up again. Gemma nodded. She didn't say anything more to Tate. But she didn't stop either. That evening, Gemma waited until the two girls had fallen asleep. She knew Reed was still in his study because light was spilling through the crack beneath the door on the second floor. She went up the stairs, walked down the hallway, and knocked. The sound echoed through the empty hall. Silence held for a few seconds. Then Reed's voice came from inside, without looking up, without inviting her in. What? Gemma opened the door and stepped in. Reed's study was spacious, lit by the warm yellow glow of a desk lamp, smelling of wood and leather. Reed was sitting behind the desk, reading something on his laptop screen. He looked up, saw Gemma, and frowned slightly. Clearly, he hadn't expected her to be there. Is something wrong with the children? Nothing's wrong. They're asleep. Reed looked at her, waiting. If it wasn't about the children, then why had she come here? Gemma took a few more steps into the room, but she didn't sit down. She stood across from the desk, looked straight at Reed, and said, Blythe drew a family picture last week. I was in it. Darcy was in it. Tate was in it. She paused for a beat. You weren't. Reed didn't react. His face didn't change, but his hands stopped on the keyboard, and he didn't turn back to the screen. Gemma continued, I've only been here 2 weeks. Tate has been here 10 years. But in your daughter's drawing, you're not there. Don't you see anything wrong with that? The silence stretched. Reed closed the laptop. Slowly, he stood, walked around the desk, and stopped right in front of Gemma. He was almost a head taller than she was. At that distance, Gemma could feel the weight of Reed Kingsley's presence. Not because he was large, or because he threatened with muscle. It was because of those eyes. Cold, clouded, expressionless. The kind of eyes Gemma was certain had made countless people lower their heads and leave the room. You're the first person in this house who's dared to speak to me like that. Reed's voice was low. He didn't raise it, didn't threaten, but every word was heavy. Gemma felt her heart beating faster. She wasn't brave by nature. She was someone who had lost her mother, lost her job, lost almost everything, and still stood back up. She knew what fear was. But she also knew there were 2 children sleeping downstairs without their father reading them a bedtime story, and that frightened her more than anyone's eyes ever could. She didn't step back. The girls need to go outside. They need air different from the air inside these 4 walls, and they need you to go with them. Not Tate, not me, you. Reed looked at her for a few more seconds. Then he turned, walked back to the desk, and sat down in his chair. He opened the laptop, as if the conversation had ended. Gemma stood there, not knowing whether he was refusing or thinking. Then Reed said, his eyes on the screen, One afternoon, don't make me repeat myself. Gemma stayed still for 1 more second, then nodded and stepped out of the room. She closed the door softly, walked down the hallway, and didn't smile until she reached the first floor, where no one could see. The next morning, Gemma was preparing breakfast for the girls when Tate walked into the kitchen. He looked at her, placed one hand on the countertop, and said simply, he agreed, Saturday. Gemma looked up. Tate watched her a moment longer, then added, his voice half surprised and half admiring. In 10 years, no one's ever made him change his mind with a drawing. Gemma didn't answer. She turned back to pour milk for Darcy, but in her mind, she had already begun calculating. Saturday. She had 4 days to prepare an afternoon. Reed Kingsley wouldn't be able to forget. Tate called to ask Reed where he wanted to go. Reed didn't know. He asked Tate in return. Tate suggested a private hill area outside the city, quiet, easy to control for security. Reed agreed without asking another question. Saturday, 4 days from now. Saturday came faster than Gemma had expected. She woke at 5 o'clock in the morning and went down to the kitchen to prepare. The wrap ingredients had been bought the day before. Vegetables, ready grilled chicken, sauce, tortilla wraps. She didn't roll them in advance, but packed each item separately into containers, because she wanted all 4 of them to sit together and make their own wraps on the spot. 2 large cartons of juice, 1 orange, 1 apple, a large picnic blanket, drawing supplies for Blythe, a new set of crayons Gemma had bought with her own money, napkins, paper plates, a cooler bag to keep the food fresh. She checked everything twice, then loaded it all into the trunk. At 7 o'clock, the 2 girls came downstairs. Gemma said, "Today we're going out. Your father too." Darcy looked at Gemma, her eyes widening. "Daddy's going with us?" Blythe didn't say anything, but she lifted her head from her drawing, and that alone said more than any sentence could have. At 8 o'clock, Reed appeared on the stairs. Gemma was tying Darcy's shoelaces. She looked up and almost smiled. Reed was wearing a black suit, a white shirt buttoned all the way to the collar, and polished leather shoes, looking as if he were getting ready to walk into a boardroom instead of spending time outdoors with 2 5-year-old children. Gemma looked at him and tried to keep her voice normal. "Do you have anything more comfortable?" Reed looked down at his suit, then looked at Gemma, then looked back at the suit again. He said nothing and went back upstairs. 5 minutes later, he came down wearing a gray t-shirt and khaki pants. This was probably the first time in many years that Reed Kingsley had worn a t-shirt outside his bedroom. Darcy looked at her father, her mouth falling open. "Daddy looks different." Blythe stood beside her, covering her mouth as she gave a small laugh. Reed looked at his 2 daughters, not knowing how to react to being laughed at, so he only stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking more awkward than Gemma had ever seen him. The 4 of them got into the car. Reed drove. Gemma sat in the passenger seat, and the 2 girls sat in the back. 2 black cars followed behind them at a careful distance, according to Tate's instructions. In the car, Darcy kept asking one question after another. "Where are we going? Is it far? Is there a lake? Is there grass?" Reed looked in the rearview mirror and saw Darcy bouncing in her seat, saw Blythe holding the new box of crayons on her lap, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in a car with his 2 daughters. The hill area was 40 minutes outside the city by car. There was only one road leading in, lined on both sides by tall trees, and ahead, it opened onto a wide, grassy slope. Below it was a small lake, its surface glittering beneath the morning sun. The wind was light, the sky clear. The guards spread out into their positions around the area, earpieces in place, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Gemma stepped out of the car and took a long breath. The air was completely different from the mansion. Darcy jumped out of the car and shouted, "So much grass!" then ran straight onto the lawn. Blythe stepped down more slowly, looking around with wide eyes, holding the box of crayons tightly. Gemma spread the blanket beneath a large tree and began laying out the food and supplies. She looked over at Reed. He was standing in the middle of the grass, both arms hanging at his sides, looking around as if he had no idea what to do. The man who could command an entire organization with one phone call was now standing on a grassy hillside, looking completely out of place. Gemma didn't help. She deliberately left Reed to manage on his own. She knew that if she guided him through every step, this afternoon would become Gemma's afternoon, not Reed's. He needed to find his own way. Darcy ran back and tugged on Reed's hand. "Daddy, come with me." Reed looked down at the small hand holding his, then looked over at Gemma. She gave a slight nod. He looked down at the leather shoes he still hadn't changed out of, then bent down, took off his shoes, took off his socks, and placed them neatly beside the blanket. Then he stepped onto the grass barefoot. Awkwardly, slowly, but he stepped. Darcy pulled her father up the grassy slope. Reed ran after her, clumsy, unaccustomed to running on uneven ground. But he didn't stop. While Darcy was leading Reed along the slope, she suddenly stopped, dropped into a crouch, and pointed at a leaf. "Daddy, look, what's this?" A beetle was crawling slowly across the surface of the leaf, its shell shining green. Darcy was both frightened and curious, reaching out her hand, then pulling it back. Reed crouched beside his daughter and looked at the beetle. He didn't know its name either. Blythe came over and crouched down to look too. The father and his two daughters sat together on the grass, watching a beetle no bigger than a fingertip, and no one said anything. Gemma stood at a distance, watching the scene, and felt something tighten in her chest. When the beetle crawled away, Gemma called everyone back to the blanket for lunch. She laid out the ingredients: tortillas, vegetables, meat, sauce. Everyone makes their own. Darcy was excited and grabbed a tortilla right away, stuffing it full of filling. Blythe was more careful, arranging each layer of vegetables. Reed watched everyone make their wraps, then picked up a tortilla and began to copy them. He added chicken, added vegetables, poured on sauce, rolled it. The filling all fell out. He rolled it a second time. It still fell out. Sauce stuck all over his hand. Darcy looked at her father's crooked, crushed wrap and burst out laughing. "Daddy's is the ugliest!" Reed looked at the wrap in his hand, then at Blythe's neat one, then back at his own. He said nothing. Darcy raised her hand. "But I want to eat Daddy's." She took the wrap from Reed's hand, bit into it deeply, chewed, her eyes smiling. Reed watched Darcy eat the misshapen wrap he had made, watched the sauce stuck to her cheek, and his shoulders lowered. It wasn't a sigh. It was only a letting go. For the first time that whole afternoon, he no longer looked like a man sitting in the wrong place. After lunch, Darcy ran out toward the farther stretch of grass. She ran fast, farther and farther from the blanket. Gemma noticed before she could call out. One of the guards had already shifted position, stepping lightly to the side, standing directly in Darcy's path. The little girl naturally changed direction and ran back without realizing she had just been blocked. So professional, it was invisible. Gemma looked over at Reed. He was sitting on the blanket, but his eyes had followed Darcy from the moment she left it. He gave the guard a slight nod, his eyes never leaving his daughter. Gemma looked at that gaze and understood. This was how Reed loved. Controlling, watching, protecting from a distance. He didn't know how to hold his children, how to play with them, how to talk to them, but he knew how to make sure no one could touch them. Reed Kingsley wasn't someone who didn't know love. He had only forgotten how to love without control. After lunch, Darcy pulled Reed down toward the lake. The lake was small, the water clear, the afternoon sun shining down over it in glittering shards of light. Darcy picked up a flat stone from the shore and threw it into the water. The stone dropped with a splash and sank at once. "Why doesn't the stone skip, Daddy?" Reed looked at the sinking stone, then at the surface of the lake, and something passed briefly through his eyes. He bent down, picked up a thin, flat stone that fit neatly in his hand. "You have to choose a flat one, then throw it sideways, close to the surface." He threw it. The stone skipped 3 times across the lake before sinking. Darcy cried out, "Oh, how did you do that, Daddy?" Reed looked at his daughter, and for the first time that afternoon, he said more than one sentence. "When I was young, I used to go down to the river and skip stones. Pick the flattest one, keep your hand level, and turn your wrist when you throw." He picked up another stone and handed it to Darcy. "You try." Darcy held the stone, copied Reed's stance, and threw it. The stone flew up into the air, then dropped straight into the water. It didn't skip. "Throw again." Darcy threw a second time. It still dropped with a splash. A third time, a fourth time, a fifth time. Every stone sank. The little girl started to frown, but she didn't give up. Reed stood beside her, patiently picking up stones, handing them to her, adjusting the angle of her hand, repeating it again and again. He didn't say, "It's all right," or "You're already good." He only handed her another stone and said, "Throw again." Gemma sat on the blanket more than 10 meters away, watching father and daughter standing beside the lake. Blythe sat beside her, drawing. But from time to time, she also lifted her head to look at her father and her sister. The 10th time, Darcy held the stone, took a breath, twisted her wrist the way Reed had shown her, and threw it. The stone touched the surface of the water, skipped up, touched again, skipped once more, and only then sank, twice. Darcy stood there for 1 second, eyes wide, then spun around, her whole face lighting up. "Daddy! Daddy! Look! I did it!" She shouted so loudly that several birds by the lake shot up into the air. Her cry rang over the water, echoed up the hillside, and reached the place where Gemma was sitting. Reed stood there, looking at his daughter. Darcy was jumping in place, pointing at the lake, smiling so brightly. This wasn't the daddy Darcy used whenever she caught a glimpse of Reed in the hallway. It wasn't the mechanical call of habit, because adults had taught her that was what she was supposed to say. This was daddy with joy bursting out from inside her. The cry of a child who wanted her father to see that she had done something. Reed swallowed hard. It took him a few seconds before he could speak, his voice slightly hoarse. "I saw. You did very well." Darcy laughed and turned back to pick up more stones, throwing again, unaware that her father was standing behind her with red-rimmed eyes. Right then, Reed's phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket and looked at the screen. The name of an important business partner appeared. Reed's reflex was to stand, walk away, and answer. His body had already begun turning before his mind had time to think. Darcy turned back, saw her father looking at the phone, and her face fell. The bright smile she'd just had disappeared in a second. She said nothing, only turned back toward the lake and went silent. Blythe, from the blanket, lifted her head to look at her father, then lowered it again and went back to drawing. Not surprised, not disappointed, only turning away, as if she was already used to this. Reed looked at the phone, looked at Darcy standing by the lake, her back turned to him, her shoulders slightly slumped, looked at Blythe with her head bent over the blanket, no longer bothering to look up. Then he looked back at the phone. He ended the call, put the phone into his pants pocket, sat down again beside the lake, next to Darcy. "I'm here. Keep playing." Darcy turned back, looked at her father, looked at his hand no longer holding the phone, and her smile returned. She picked up another stone and handed it to Reed. "Daddy, throw with me." Gemma stood by the blanket and witnessed it all. She smiled, turned away, and pretended to be busy arranging the food in the containers. But her hand paused for a moment before continuing, because she knew she had just seen something rare. Reed Kingsley choosing his daughter instead of work. Perhaps for the first time, on the blanket, Blythe drew all afternoon. She drew the grass, the hill, the lake, the sky. Then, in the right corner of the picture, she added a tall human figure standing beside the lake. The man in the picture had no facial details, only a tall, lean shape, but Gemma knew at once who it was. For the first time, Blythe's father appeared in her drawing. Gemma said nothing. She only quietly took out her phone and photographed the picture. Blythe watched her take the photo, but didn't object. After that, the little girl took Gemma's phone and said softly, "I'll take pictures of everyone." Blythe walked around taking pictures of everything. Darcy throwing stones, Gemma folding the blanket, Reed sitting beside the lake. Most of the photos were crooked, blurred, or cut off half of someone's head. But there was one, by chance, so beautiful that Gemma stopped when she saw it. In that photo, Reed was smiling. Not a polite smile, not a smile because someone was looking. He was looking in one direction, the corner of his mouth slightly curved, his eyes gentle. The direction he was looking was toward Gemma. And he didn't know he was being photographed. Sunset settled over the hillside. The sunlight shifted from gold to orange, then to pink. The wind slowly grew colder. Gemma packed the things into the bag and folded the blanket. "Let's go home." The four of them walked down the hill toward the car. Darcy ran ahead, Reed walking behind her. Blythe walked beside Gemma, holding the box of crayons. Halfway down the slope, Blythe suddenly turned aside, ran over to Reed, and took her father's hand. No words, no permission asked. She only reached out her small hand and held Reed's. Reed went rigid. His hand froze for half a second before closing around his daughter's. Darcy saw it, ran back, and took his other hand. Reed walked between his two daughters down the hillside, his steps slow. He said nothing. There was no need to say anything. Gemma walked behind them, looking at the three backs ahead of her, the tall man in the middle, the two little girls on either side, 6 feet moving through the grass in the sunset. Her eyes grew wet. The next morning, Gemma was pouring milk for the two girls when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Reed appeared at the kitchen doorway, for the first time in 3 years. Darcy looked up, milk on her lips. "Daddy." Are you eating breakfast with me? Reed sat down, poured milk for himself, and spilled it onto the table. Darcy laughed. Daddy, you're really bad at it, but I like you being here. Reed didn't know how to answer. He only wiped the milk from the table and sat there eating with his daughters. After breakfast, when the two girls went upstairs to their room, Reed remained in the kitchen with Gemma. He was silent for a moment, then said in a low voice, I don't know how to be a father. For the past 3 years, I haven't known how. Gemma looked at him. No judgment, no pity, no saying, I understand. She only said, you don't need to be perfect, just be present. Reed nodded. He stepped out of the kitchen, went up to the second floor, entered his study, and closed the door. But that day, he opened the study door earlier than usual. And that evening, he came downstairs to have dinner with the girls. For the first time, but the world outside the Kingsley mansion didn't give Reed much time to live in peace like that. That night, the mansion was silent. The two girls had been asleep since 8 o'clock. Gemma had gone back to her room as well. In the second-floor hallway, only the light spilling from Reed's study remained, as it did every night. Reed was reading a financial report on the screen when Tate knocked. The knock was different from usual, 2 urgent taps instead of 3 steady ones. Reed looked up. Tate stepped in, holding a brown envelope with no stamp and no return address. The night guard found this at the side gate, wedged between the iron bars. None of the cameras recorded who put it there. Reed looked at the envelope, then at Tate. He reached out and took it, opened it. Inside were 3 photographs. The first, the Kingsley mansion, taken from the east side, from an angle where the fence was partly hidden by trees. The second, Gemma's car in the parking lot near the supermarket, the license plate clear as day, taken in the middle of the day. The third made Reed stop. An old photograph, printed on photo paper, slightly yellowed around the edges. In the picture was his wife. It had been taken in the mansion garden, under the afternoon sun, and she was smiling, holding a glass of water. This wasn't a public photograph, not a picture from the internet, not a press photo. This was a photograph Reed had taken himself, stored on his personal computer, in a folder, locked behind 3 layers of passwords. Either someone had breached his private storage system, or someone inside his network had sold information to the outside. Both possibilities were serious. Reed looked at the photograph of his wife. The message didn't need to be written in words. The photograph said everything. Last time, he had lost his wife. This time, who did he want to lose? Reed's hand tightened. The corner of the photograph bent in his palm. Tate stood across from him, watching. In 10 years at Reed Kingsley's side, Tate had seen his boss angry many times. Reed's anger was cold, not hot. He didn't slam tables, didn't shout, didn't throw things. He went silent. And Tate knew, the quieter Reed became, the more serious the matter was. Right now, Reed was so silent that Tate felt a chill run down his spine. But what truly worried Tate was Reed's hand. His hand was trembling. Only slightly, but it was trembling. Not from fear. Tate knew Reed Kingsley wasn't afraid of anyone in this world. It trembled from rage. The kind of rage Tate had seen only once before, 3 years earlier, on the night Reed's wife died. Reed placed the photograph on the desk, arranged the 3 pictures side by side, the mansion, Gemma's car, his wife. He looked at the 3 photographs, then said, his voice even and slow, each word as clear as if he were reading a sentence. Who took them? When they were taken? And why my security team didn't detect it? Tate could answer the first question. The mansion photo had been taken with a telephoto lens, from a distance, possibly from the hill to the east. The second, the photo of Gemma's car had been taken about 3 days earlier, based on the location of the supermarket Gemma usually went to. The third, Tate went silent. He had no answer. The security team had detected no one approaching the fence, detected no one following Gemma's car, detected no one breaching the private data. Reed looked at Tate. He didn't need to say it. Tate understood. This was a failure. Replace the entire outer security shift. Check who accessed my personal files over the past 6 months, before tomorrow morning. Tate nodded and stepped out. Reed remained alone in the study, looking at the 3 photographs on the desk. He knew who this was. Drake Holloway, the head of a rival organization, the man Reed had suspected for 3 years of being connected to his wife's death, though he had never found enough proof. Holloway didn't need to write a threatening letter. He only needed to leave an envelope with 3 photographs, and Reed understood everything. He was saying, I can see your house, I can see your people, and I can drag out your most painful memory whenever I want. Reed didn't call the police. He never called the police. He didn't tell Gemma either. The next morning, when Gemma went down to the kitchen to make breakfast, she noticed something different. There were more guards than yesterday. She counted 4 new men she had never seen before, standing at positions around the yard and in the hallways. Tate appeared in the kitchen earlier than usual and told Gemma that from now on, she shouldn't go out alone. Someone would always accompany her. Gemma looked at Tate. What happened? Tate answered in a normal voice. Routine security procedure. Nothing special. Gemma didn't believe him. She saw Tate avoid her eyes as he spoke, and she realized this wasn't routine security procedure. Something had happened in the night, but she didn't ask any more. She had lived in this house long enough to know there were questions Tate wouldn't answer, and there were things Reed Kingsley kept to himself. Upstairs, in the study, Reed sat behind his desk. The 3 photographs were still there. He picked up the photograph of his wife and looked closely. Her smile in the picture, the glass of water in her hand, the afternoon sunlight in the garden. He remembered that day. He remembered what he had said. He remembered the sound of her laughter. For 3 years, he had put every photograph away, locked every memory up, thinking that if he didn't see it, it wouldn't hurt. Now an enemy had dragged that photograph out to threaten him, and Reed realized he couldn't run from memory forever. He placed his wife's photograph down on the desk, standing it upright, leaning it against the base of the lamp. He didn't put it away. He left it there. As a reminder to himself, he wouldn't let history repeat itself. Not ever again. A few days passed. The new guards still stood at their positions around the mansion. Gemma still didn't ask any more questions, but she could feel the change in the air. Tate was more tense. His phone rang constantly, and every time he took a call, he left the room. Reed was the opposite. He came down to have breakfast with the 2 girls every day, as if that picnic had opened a door he no longer wanted to close. He was still awkward, still a man of few words, but he was present, and the 2 little girls began getting used to seeing their father at the dining table. One evening, Gemma sat on Darcy's bed, reading a bedtime story. Blythe lay on the other bed, facing the wall, silently listening. Gemma read slowly, her voice even, the storybook about a little fox searching for home. Darcy made it halfway through the book before her eyes grew heavy, her breathing gradually steadied, and she fell asleep. Gemma closed the book, pulled the blanket over Darcy, then stood to turn off the nightlight. Miss Gemma. Blythe's small voice came from the other bed. Gemma turned back. Blythe had rolled over and was lying on her back, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. What did my mother look like? Gemma stopped in the middle of the room. She didn't sit down right away. She stood there, looking at Blythe, and felt something heavy settle inside her chest. Blythe continued, her voice still small, but every word was clear, as if she had thought about this sentence for a very long time before finally saying it aloud. I asked Daddy, but Daddy never talks about her. There aren't any pictures of Mommy in the house. I don't know what she liked, what her voice sounded like, whether she laughed a lot. Gemma sat down on the edge of Blythe's bed. The little girl was still looking at the ceiling, not at Gemma, as if looking someone directly in the eyes while asking this question would be too hard. Gemma didn't have an answer. She had never met Blythe's mother. She didn't know what that woman had looked like in real life. Apart from the photograph in the envelope she didn't even know existed. She couldn't invent a memory that wasn't there, but she could do something else. She placed her hand gently on Blythe's hair. Let me talk to your father. He'll tell you about her. Blythe didn't answer, but she turned onto her side, facing Gemma, and closed her eyes. Gemma sat there for a few more minutes, until Blythe's breathing became steady. Then she stood, stepped out of the room, and closed the door. She went straight up to the second floor. Light was still spilling from Reed's study. She knocked. This time, without hesitation, Reed opened the door, saw Gemma, and frowned slightly. She stepped inside, stood before the desk, and said, Blythe just asked me what her mother looked like. Reed didn't react. His face didn't change. But he rose from his chair, turned, and walked toward the window. Turned his back to Gemma. Silence stretched on. Gemma waited. She didn't push him, didn't add anything more. She stood there, waiting for Reed to find the words on his own. It took a long time, perhaps a full minute. Then Reed spoke, his voice low. his eyes on the window. I put away every picture of her, all of them, right after the funeral. I thought if the children didn't see her, didn't remember her, then it wouldn't hurt. He stopped. But she's hurting because she isn't allowed to remember. Gemma said nothing. There was no need. Reed had already heard the answer inside his own words. She gave a slight nod, then stepped out of the room, leaving Reed alone. The next morning, Reed didn't come down to have breakfast with the two girls. Gemma was a little worried, but she didn't ask. She fed the girls and took them upstairs to play. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, she heard Reed's footsteps in the second-floor hallway, then the sound of the girls' bedroom door opening. Gemma was at the end of the hall. She stopped and didn't come closer. Reed stepped into the girls' room. In his hand was a new picture frame, simple, made of light-colored wood. Inside the frame was the photograph of his wife. The very photograph from Holloway's envelope, the photograph his enemy had used to threaten him, to remind him of loss, to make him afraid. Reed had taken that photograph and had it framed. He placed it on Blythe's bedside table. Blythe was sitting on the floor, drawing. She lifted her head when she heard her father, looked at Reed, then looked at the picture frame in his hand. The little girl stood, stepped toward the bedside table, and looked at the photograph. She looked for a long time. The woman in the picture was smiling, holding a glass of water, afternoon sunlight behind her. Blythe looked at the photograph, then looked at Reed. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. She stepped forward and hugged her father tightly. Her tiny arms wrapped around Reed's waist, her face pressed against his shirt. Reed stood stiffly. Then slowly, he placed his hand on his daughter's back. Darcy was playing on the bed. When she saw her sister hugging their father, she immediately jumped down and ran over. "I want a hug too." She rushed in, hugging both her father and her sister. Reed knelt down. He knelt in the middle of his daughter's bedroom, holding both girls, his eyes red. He said nothing. There was no need. Outside the room, Gemma stood in the hallway, her back against the wall. She didn't step inside. She looked through the narrow opening of the door and saw father and daughters holding each other in the middle of the room, saw the photograph on the bedside table, saw the morning sunlight pouring through the window and falling over their three shadows. Tears slid down her face. She didn't wipe them away. She simply let them fall, because there are moments when crying is the truest thing a person can do. The photograph Drake Holloway had sent to threaten Reed Kingsley now sat on Blythe's bedside table, in a light wooden frame, beside the box of crayons and the stack of drawing paper. The enemy's weapon had become a daughter's keepsake, and it was the most beautiful thing in the room. 3 days after the morning, Reed brought the photograph into the girls' room. Everything inside the mansion began to find a different rhythm. Reed came down for breakfast regularly. Blythe talked more. Darcy began telling stories at the dining table without anyone having to ask first. The photograph on the bedside table remained there, and every night before sleep, Blythe looked at it for a while before closing her eyes. Gemma watched all of it, and for the first time since stepping into this house, she felt that everything was moving in the right direction. Then her phone rang. It was noon, and the two girls had just gone upstairs for their nap. Gemma was cleaning the kitchen when an unknown number called. She answered. On the other end was the voice of a middle-aged woman, polite and formal. "Excuse me, may I speak with Miss Gemma Lawson? I'm calling from St. Catherine Hospital." Gemma's hand stopped. St. Catherine, the hospital where she had worked 3 years earlier, the place where her mother had spent her final months, the place that had been closed for more than 2 years. "This is Gemma. Miss Lawson, we're clearing out the storage rooms before the building is demolished. In the personal locker of a former employee, we found an envelope with your name on it. Inside is a handwritten letter. The handwriting on the envelope says, 'To Gemma. We think this may be important personal property.'" Gemma said nothing for a few seconds. A handwritten letter in a personal locker to Gemma. Her mother had been hospitalized at St. Catherine for 7 months before she died. 7 long months, with Gemma going back and forth between her shifts and her mother's hospital room, sleeping in a hospital chair more often than she slept at home. Her mother had loved to write. Journals, letters, little notes tucked inside books. If she had written a letter to Gemma and left it in a locker, then there was a strong chance Gemma had never received it. The woman on the phone continued. "The building will be demolished at the end of this month. We can't send it by mail because this is personal property that requires direct identity verification. Can you come pick it up this week? Gemma knew the rule. Tate had made it clear. Don't go out alone. Always have someone with her. She knew the mansion was under tighter security than usual, even if no one had told her why. She knew she should tell Tate, should let a guard go with her. But this was her mother's letter. Her mother was gone. And maybe, in that letter, her mother had written something to her that she'd never had the chance to read. 7 years without seeing her father. 3 years since losing her mother. Gemma had lost almost every loved one in her life. If there was one final letter from her mother lying inside a building, about to be torn down, she couldn't let Reed Kingsley's guards accompany her to receive it. This was between her and her mother. No one else. Gemma waited until the two girls were asleep for their nap. She checked the room, pulled the blanket over Darcy, drew the curtains for Blythe. Then she took her car keys, went down to the first floor, and left through the back door. She avoided the main hallway where the guards usually stood, went around through the side garden, and out the side gate. She knew she was breaking the rule. And she knew that if Tate found out, she'd have to explain. But right then, she couldn't think about anything except her mother's handwriting on the envelope. To Gemma. She drove 30 minutes to the old hospital. The building looked completely different from how she remembered it. The main entrance was closed, the sign had been taken down, and the parking lot was empty. A wire fence surrounded part of the construction site, with several warning signs marking the demolition area. Deserted. No one at the reception desk, no lights inside, no sign that anyone was working there to clear out storage. Gemma stopped the car and looked around. Her stomach began to tighten. Something wasn't right. Then she saw the black car, parked in the far corner of the parking lot, its front facing her. Not a hospital car, not a construction security vehicle. Two men stepped out of the black car and walked straight toward her. They wore dark suits, their steps even, not hurried, but not slow. One of them stopped a few steps from Gemma's car, his voice calm. "Miss Lawson, sorry to trouble you. Get in the car. Someone wants to speak with you." Gemma understood immediately. There was no letter, no personal locker. No hospital employee had called her. All of it was a trap. Holloway's people had studied her. They knew where she had worked. They knew where her mother had died. They knew what could make her lower her guard. And they had used her own longing for her mother to draw her out of the mansion. Alone, with no one knowing. Gemma looked at the two men, looked at the black car, looked at the abandoned hospital behind them. There was no one around. No guard, no Tate, no Reed. Only her, and two strangers standing between her and her own car. They said nothing more. They didn't need to. Gemma got into the black car. They drove for about 20 minutes into an old industrial area on the edge of the city. They stopped in front of a warehouse. They opened the car door, led Gemma inside, through a narrow hallway, then opened an iron door leading into an empty room. 4 gray walls, 1 light bulb on the ceiling, 1 metal chair in the middle of the room. Nothing else. Sit and wait. Then they walked out and closed the door. Gemma sat on the metal chair, alone, in the empty room. She hadn't been hit, hadn't been tied up, hadn't been threatened with words. She was only left sitting there, in silence, understanding that she had walked into the very trap she should have seen coming. The message wasn't meant for her. The message was meant for Reed Kingsley. That they could reach anyone he cared about, anytime they wanted. Gemma sat on the metal chair in the middle of the empty room. The light bulb on the ceiling glowed dimly, just enough for her to see the 4 gray walls and nothing else. No window, no clock. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there. Maybe 1 hour, maybe 2 hours. Time moved differently when there was nothing to look at, no one to talk to, and no sound except her own breathing. She was afraid, truly afraid. Her 2 hands rested on her lap, and she realized they were trembling, but she didn't cry. Gemma Lawson had cried enough already. She had cried when her mother died, cried when her father disappeared before that, cried when the hospital closed and she lost her job. She had cried enough for an entire lifetime, and now, sitting in an empty room, in the middle of a warehouse she didn't even know the location of, she refused to cry anymore. She thought of Darcy, thought of the night the little girl held her hand and asked softly, "Miss Gemma, are you going to stay?" She had said, "I'll be here." She thought of Blythe, thought of the first time the little girl pushed the drawing toward her, saying nothing, only pushing it forward, like a door opened just a crack, a door that would close forever if Gemma rushed. She hadn't rushed. She had waited, and Blythe had opened the door for her. Gemma clenched both hands and told herself, "I'll go home." At the Kingsley mansion, the two girls woke from their nap at 3 o'clock. Darcy ran down to the first floor looking for Gemma. The family room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Darcy called, "Miss Gemma?" No one answered. Darcy went to find Tate. Tate checked Gemma's room, the bathroom, the garden. Nothing. He took out his phone and called Gemma. No answer. He called a second time, a third time. No one picked up. Tate checked the security cameras. The footage at 1:20 in the afternoon showed Gemma leaving through the side gate, alone, driving away from the mansion. No one was with her. Tate watched it twice to be sure, then went up to the second floor and knocked on the door of Reed's study. He stepped inside and said curtly, "Gemma isn't in the house." The camera recorded her leaving alone at 1:20. She isn't answering her phone. Reed's face changed, not slowly, instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Everything soft that Gemma had drawn out of him in recent weeks vanished in a single second. Only coldness remained. The coldness Tate knew well. The coldness of Reed Kingsley when something serious had happened. Track her phone. Tate had already done it before Reed said the words. Gemma's phone was still on. The GPS signal showed that she was in the old industrial area west of the city, not moving. Staying in one place. Tate gave him the coordinates. Reed didn't call the police. He called his own team. 5 hours after Gemma had left the mansion, the iron door of the empty room opened. Gemma looked up. Light from the hallway poured in, blinding after so many hours, with only the dim bulb on the ceiling. She narrowed her eyes, and when her vision adjusted to the light, she saw Reed. He stood in the doorway, dark suit, cold face, but his eyes weren't cold. Reed looked at Gemma with something she had never seen in him before. Not anger, not coldness. Something deeper, heavier, something Gemma couldn't name at that moment. He held out his hand, said nothing, only held out his hand. Gemma looked at his hand, then took it. Stood up. Her legs trembled, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and she stumbled half a step. Reed held her hand tightly, his other hand supporting her elbow, and led her out of the room. Outside the warehouse, Gemma saw 3 of Reed's black cars parked in a row. Guards stood spread out around the area. And in the corner of the parking lot, the car from Holloway's men was still there. The 2 men from earlier were standing beside it, looking toward the warehouse. They saw Reed step out, saw the security team behind him, and they got into the car, started the engine, and drove away. No words, no looking back. Gemma watched the car disappear at the end of the road, and she realized they weren't leaving because there were so many guards. Not because they were afraid of being arrested. They left because they had seen Reed Kingsley personally standing at the warehouse door. That was enough. Reed led Gemma to the car, opened the door for her. Gemma sat in the passenger seat, and Reed took the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine right away. He sat there for a few seconds, both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Then he reached his right hand over and took Gemma's hand, said nothing. Didn't ask whether she was all right. Didn't ask what had happened. Only held her hand. Held it tightly. Then he started the engine and drove out of the industrial area. For the entire 30-minute drive back to the mansion, Reed didn't let go of Gemma's hand. He drove with one hand, the other holding hers, and he didn't say a single word. Gemma was silent too. She looked out the window, watching the streets fall away behind them, and felt Reed's hand closed around hers. The hand that had once signed million-dollar contracts, the hand that had once held a phone and ordered people driven out of the city, was now holding hers as if he were afraid that if he let go, she would disappear. The car stopped in front of the mansion. Reed turned off the engine, sat still for a while longer. Then he turned to look at Gemma and said, in a low voice, only one sentence, "This won't happen a second time." Gemma looked at him. She wanted to say something. Sorry for leaving alone. Thank you for coming to find me. But no words were enough, so she only nodded. Holloway's people had only needed to send one message, and they had sent it successfully. But for Reed, that message was enough too. Holloway had touched someone he shouldn't have touched. That night, after the 2 girls had fallen asleep, Reed called Gemma up to his study. She stepped inside and saw him standing beside the window, his back turned. On the desk were still the 3 photographs from Holloway's envelope, and beside them was the photograph of his wife, propped against the base of the lamp. Reed turned to look at Gemma. His eyes were cold, but not the coldness of a boss giving an order. It was the coldness of a man trying to control something inside himself that he didn't want to reveal. "He knew about your mother," Reed said, his voice even. "He knew where you used to work, knew where your mother died, knew what would make you lower your guard. He used all of it to draw you out of here." Gemma stood still. She didn't deny it. "You should leave. I'll pay you 6 months' salary. Arrange a safe place for you to stay. You won't have to worry about money." Gemma looked at Reed. She understood what he was doing. This wasn't firing her. This was the way Reed Kingsley protected people, by pushing them away. 3 years ago, he had pushed his 2 daughters away. Now he was pushing her away. "I know," Gemma said, her voice soft but not trembling. "I was wrong to go out alone. I shouldn't have broken the rule." Reed shook his head slightly. "This isn't about rules. Next time, it won't be just sitting in a warehouse." Silence. Gemma looked straight into Reed's eyes. "I'm not leaving." Reed looked at her. His gaze changed, just a little, enough for Gemma to notice. Not anger, not disappointment, surprise. "Why?" Gemma was silent for a moment. She thought about the empty room in the warehouse, thought about the hours, sitting alone on the metal chair, thought about all the reasonable reasons she should leave this place. Then she thought of Darcy holding her hand every night before sleep, of Blythe pushing a drawing toward her for the first time, of the morning Reed spilled milk on the dining table and Darcy laughed, of bare feet stepping on grass, of the cry of Daddy ringing beside the lake, of 3 backs walking down the hill in the sunset. "Because this is the first place where I've felt I belong." Reed didn't answer. He stood there, looking at Gemma, and said nothing more, nor did he bring up her leaving again. Gemma gave a slight nod, then stepped out of the room. She walked down the hallway to her own room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. And for the first time since she'd been taken into the warehouse, she trembled, truly trembled. Not because she was afraid, because she had just realized she had chosen to stay in a dangerous place because of people she loved. And that decision was heavier than anything she had ever decided in her life. Gemma sat on the bed for a long time. Then she stood, opened the closet, and took out her suitcase. She began packing. Not because Reed had told her to, but because, inside her head, a voice kept repeating, "If I stay, Holloway will use me to get close to the girls. I'm the weakness. I'm the opening. My being here keeps everyone in this house from being safe." She folded shirts, folded pants, packed a few books. Then she sat down at the small desk in her room, took out paper and a pen, and wrote, "To Blythe and Darcy." Her hand shook as she wrote. She wrote slowly. Word by word. She didn't know what to write, because there were no words enough to explain to 2 5-year-old children why an adult would promise to stay and then disappear. She wrote half a page, then stopped. Looked at the writing on the paper, looked at the open suitcase on the bed. Then she folded the paper, placed it inside an envelope, and left it on the desk. Turned off the light, lay down. She couldn't sleep. The next morning, Gemma had just opened her eyes when she heard small feet running in the hallway. Her bedroom door flew open. Darcy ran in, calling, "Miss Gemma, are you awake? I'm hungry." The little girl stopped in the middle of the room. Darcy's eyes saw the open suitcase on the bed, clothes folded inside, the envelope on the desk. She stood still, looking at the suitcase, looking at Gemma. Her eyes widened. "Miss Gemma?" One word. Only one word. But inside that word was everything. 4 caregivers who had vanished one after another. Mornings when she woke up and found the nanny's room empty. The question, "Are you going to stay?" that Darcy had been forced to ask too many times in her life. Gemma looked at Darcy, looked at those wide, round eyes, looked at the small hand clutching the hem of her nightgown, looked at her bare feet standing on the cold wooden floor. She walked to the bed, closed the suitcase, and pushed it under the bed. Took the envelope from the desk and slipped it into a drawer. "I was only tidying my things. I'm not going anywhere." Darcy watched the suitcase disappear beneath the bed, then looked at Gemma, then rushed forward and hugged her. Gemma hugged Darcy back, her eyes squeezed shut, and knew that suitcase would never be opened again. The night before, while Gemma was packing her suitcase, Reed hadn't slept either. He went into his private room, the room he had moved into after his wife died, leaving behind the master bedroom with its door always closed. He stood in front of the wardrobe and opened the bottom drawer, the drawer he hadn't touched in 3 years. Inside was a silk scarf, folded neatly, its perfume faded but still faintly there if he lifted it close to his nose, and a small journal with a leather cover, its corners worn. The photograph had already been given to his daughter. The drawer felt lighter than he remembered. Reed picked up the scarf and looked at it, then set it down. He took the journal, sat on the floor, and leaned his back against the wardrobe. Opened it. His wife's handwriting. Slanted, rounded, a little hurried. He didn't read from the beginning. He turned to the last page. The final line, written in blue ink, the writing shakier than on the pages before it. You often forget that you need to be loved too, not only feared. Reed read that line. Read it again, then read it once more. He sat on the bedroom floor, his back against the wardrobe, the journal open on his lap, and looked at that line until his eyes blurred. Outside the hallway, Gemma passed by. She saw Reed's door slightly open, light spilling through the crack. She stopped and looked inside, saw Reed sitting on the floor, his back against the wardrobe, his head slightly lowered, the journal in his hand. She didn't step in, didn't knock, didn't ask if he was all right. She stood there for a few seconds, then kept walking. Because there are moments when another person's presence, even with good intentions, is an intrusion, and Gemma understood that. The next morning, Reed and Gemma met at the breakfast table. The two girls were already sitting there. Darcy was telling Blythe about the dream she'd had the night before. Reed poured coffee, and Gemma poured milk for the girls. No one mentioned the night before. No one mentioned the suitcase, the journal, or the half-open door. But Reed looked at Gemma differently, not looking at a nanny, not looking at an employee, looking at someone who had seen him in his weakest moment and hadn't used it, hadn't pitied him, hadn't demanded an explanation, only stood there, then walked away. And that, to Reed Kingsley, was worth more than any words. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Reed went out onto the second-floor balcony. He sat on the wooden chair, looking out toward the distant city. A few minutes later, Gemma came and sat beside him. The second-floor balcony looked out over the garden behind the mansion, and farther beyond it, the city skyline, where tall buildings glittered with lights in the night. The wind was light, the air cool. Reed sat in a wooden chair, holding a glass of wine he hadn't drunk from, only held. Gemma sat down in the chair beside him, carrying nothing with her, only sitting. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind, the insects in the garden, the distant low hum of the city. Then Reed spoke, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the buildings. My wife once wanted to sell everything. The house, the cars, all of it. Leave the city. Move somewhere small and quiet. Somewhere the girls could run in the yard without guards following them. He stopped, turned the wine glass in his hand. I refused. I thought that if I held power, if I controlled everything, then my family would be safe. Leaving meant giving up everything I'd built, and I believed no one would dare touch anyone who belonged to Reed Kingsley. He took a sip of wine. For the first time all evening. Then she died, and I realized power doesn't keep anyone. I controlled half this city, but I couldn't keep one person. Silence. Gemma said nothing. She sat still, listening, and understood that this was the first time Reed had spoken these things to anyone. Not to Tate, not to anyone else, to her. After that, I closed every door, put away the photographs, changed rooms, kept my distance from the girls. I thought that if I didn't get close to anyone, then losing them wouldn't hurt. Reed set the wine glass down on the balcony railing. But last night, I read her journal, the last page. He didn't say what the line was. But Gemma looked into his eyes, and she knew that line had changed something inside Reed that no one had been able to touch for 3 years. The wind passed across the balcony. Gemma spoke, her voice soft. My mother died when I was 20. Illness. She was in the hospital for 7 months. I worked during the day, and at night, I slept in a hospital chair beside her bed. By the last month, she didn't recognize me anymore, but I still sat there, every night. She stopped. My father left before that. He didn't die. He just left. One day I came home, and his things were gone. No letter, no message, no explanation. I was 17. She drew a breath. After my mother died, I lived alone, worked all kinds of jobs, and I told myself that if I didn't become attached to anyone, If I didn't need anyone, then I'd never be left behind. Reed turned to look at Gemma. This was the first time she had spoken about herself. All these weeks, she had been the listener, the observer, the one who patiently sat beside the children, the one who knocked on his study door and spoke the truth straight to him. But she had never spoken about herself. And then? Reed asked. Gemma looked toward the distant city. Then I realized living that way was even lonelier than being left behind. At least, when you're left behind, you can still remember what it felt like to have someone beside you. But when you cut everything off yourself, you have nothing left to remember. A long silence. The wind moved. City lights flickered along the horizon. Reed spoke, his voice different than before, softer, slower. Do you know why I hired you? Gemma shook her head slightly. Not because of your resume, not because Tate recommended you. That day, I had just finished a call, and I was walking through the hallway when I looked down into the family room, and I saw Blythe laugh. He stopped. 3 years! For 3 years, I hadn't heard that little girl laugh. I stood outside the railing looking down, and I couldn't walk in, not because I was busy, because I realized that a stranger, sitting on my floor for less than 1 hour, had done something I, her father, hadn't been able to do in 3 years. Gemma looked at Reed. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking into the distance, but his eyes weren't seeing the city. His eyes were looking back at that afternoon, hearing again the sound of Blythe's laughter rising from the first floor. You're not a stranger to them, Gemma said, her voice gentle but clear. You just didn't know how to come back, and you've come back now. Reed turned to look at her. In the yellow light spilling from the living room onto the balcony, Gemma saw that his eyes were wet. He wasn't crying, only wet-eyed, as if something inside him was rising, and he couldn't hold it back in time. He didn't say anything more. Neither did Gemma. They sat there, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the city at night. No kiss, no confession of love, no promises, only sitting beside each other, two people carrying wounds left by those they had lost. And for the first time in a very long while, both of them felt a little less alone. But before Reed Kingsley could be allowed peace, there was still one thing he had to do. The next morning, Reed stood before the mirror in his private room. A black suit, a white shirt, a dark tie. The silver watch he only wore when he was going to work. Polished leather shoes, the same shoes he had taken off on the grass the day of the picnic. He looked at himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him wasn't the man who had sat on a hillside making raps with his 2 daughters. Not the man who had spilled milk at the breakfast table. Not the man who had sat on the balcony last night, shoulder to shoulder with Gemma, his eyes wet. The man in the mirror was Kingsley. Reed fastened the last button of his shirt, straightened the sleeves of his suit jacket, and stepped out of the room. Before getting into the car, he sent Tate a message. Brief and direct. If anything happens today, take the girls and Gemma away. Don't wait for my order. Tate read the message, looked up, and looked at Reed as he was coming down the stairs. In 10 years walking beside his boss, this was the first time Tate had seen the name of someone outside the family appear on the protection list. He didn't ask. He only nodded, slipped the phone into his pocket, and followed Reed out to the car. The restaurant was on the highest floor of a hotel in the city center. A private room, glass walls looking out over the entire skyline. The table had been set for 2, but when Reed and Tate stepped inside, Holloway was already seated, and behind him were 4 men standing along the wall. Reed looked at the 4 men, then at Holloway, then calmly sat in the chair across from him. Tate stood behind Reed, one man. Holloway smiled, the kind of smile worn by a man who believed he had the upper hand. Reed Kingsley, it's been a long time. I hear your house has been livelier lately. New nanny, isn't it? Pretty too. Reed didn't react. He picked up the menu, glanced over it, then ordered a steak, medium rare, without looking at Holloway as he spoke to the server. Holloway leaned back in his chair and continued. 3 years ago, you lost your wife, and now you hire someone to come play with your children. You've changed a lot, Kingsley. Some people say you've gone soft. Reed still didn't answer. The food was brought out. He cut his steak, slowly, piece by piece, ate calmly, as if he were sitting alone in his own kitchen rather than across from his enemy. Holloway spoke again, his voice lowering. Be careful, or that nanny might end up like your wife. Accidents can't always be predicted. Reed's knife and fork stopped, not because of what had been said, Because he had finished eating, he set the knife and fork down, wiped his hands with the cloth napkin, folded it, and placed it on the table. Then he looked straight at Holloway. For the first time in the entire meeting, you sent an envelope to my house. You took a photograph of my wife from personal data that only I had authorization to access. You used a dead woman to threaten me. Reed's voice was even, slow, without rise or fall. The kind of voice Tate knew was the most dangerous. Then you studied her, knew where her mother died, knew what would make her lower her guard. You used an innocent woman's past to trap her. Reed leaned forward, only a little, just enough that Holloway had to lean back despite trying to remain calm. You thought that gave you power? Silence. Holloway wasn't smiling anymore. Reed reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, took out a small USB drive, and placed it in the center of the table, beside the steak plate. Inside this is every financial transaction you've made through 3 shell organizations over the past 5 years. False names, offshore accounts, money trails from 2 front companies. Enough for the federal authorities to open a file, and enough for you never to see sunlight outside prison bars again. Holloway looked at the USB drive. His face changed. The smile disappeared. His skin went pale. The 4 men standing behind him looked at one another, none of them knowing what to do. Reed continued, his voice still even. 2 choices. Leave this city and never come back, or I send this before you can make it out of the restaurant door. Holloway looked at the USB drive, looked at Reed, looked back at the USB drive. Then he stood, said nothing, and walked out of the room. The 4 men followed, closing the door behind them. Reed didn't watch them leave. He turned to Tate. Have someone follow him. If he's still in the city after 72 hours, send the USB. Tate nodded, took out his phone, and stepped into the hallway to make the call. Reed remained alone in the dining room, looking at the USB drive still lying on the table. Holloway hadn't taken it. He didn't need to. Reed had copies. He stood, walked out to the elevator, went down to the lobby, and got into the car. Tate drove. The whole way back, Reed said nothing. He looked out the window, watched the city drift past, and thought about the final line in his wife's journal. The car stopped in front of the mansion. Reed stepped out, passed through the main gate, and walked along the stone-paved path. He opened the front door and stepped into the foyer and stopped. From the kitchen came the sound of Darcy laughing. Loud laughter, spilling out, the kind of laughter children make when something is so funny they can't hold it in. Mixed with it was Gemma's voice, singing something off rhythm, off key, but singing with such joy. And behind that was Blythe's voice, smaller, but laughing too. Reed stood in the foyer, in his black suit and silver watch, having just come from a meeting with the most dangerous enemy of his life. And he stood there, listening to the laughter drifting from the kitchen, and smiled. The threat was over. Holloway would leave, or he would face the federal authorities. But Reed knew he hadn't sat across from Holloway today for territory, for money, or for power. He had done it for that laughter. The laughter echoing inside his kitchen. At this moment, right now, 3 days after the meeting with Holloway, Tate reported. Holloway had left the city. The surveillance team confirmed that he had boarded a flight the night before, one way, with no return ticket. Reed listened, nodded, and made no comment. That evening, while the 2 girls were eating dinner, Reed suddenly said, "This weekend, we're going on a picnic." Gemma was pouring water for Blythe, and her hand stopped halfway as she looked at Reed. Darcy lifted her head, her eyes lighting up. "Really, Daddy? Are we going to the hill again?" Blythe looked at her father, then at Gemma, then back at her father. The corner of her mouth curved slightly. Reed answered, "Not the hill. This time is different." He didn't explain any further. Gemma looked at him, wanting to ask, but there was something in Reed's eyes that resembled a man keeping a secret and feeling quietly pleased with it, so she didn't ask. Saturday came. Gemma was getting ready to take the 2 girls to change before going out, but Reed said, "No need. Just wear what you have on at home." Then he disappeared up to the 3rd floor. The mansion had a rooftop on the very top level, wide, tiled, with a railing that looked out over the entire garden and the distant city beyond. No one had gone up there in 3 years. Reed went up to the rooftop early that morning, before the girls woke. He brought the blanket from the family room with him, carrying it up 3 flights of stairs. He hung 2 strings of LED lights he had bought in a hurry the day before, wrapping them around the railing and stretching them across the rooftop. He set plates, cups, and napkins on the blanket, and he cooked. Reed Kingsley, who hadn't once stepped into the kitchen to cook for anyone in 3 years, had woken at 5 o'clock in the morning to cook. The result wasn't beautiful. The roasted chicken was burned on one side and raw on the other. The pasta was too salty because he had added salt twice, forgetting he had already added it the first time. The tomato sauce clumped because he hadn't stirred it constantly. The toast was the only success, but he made too much of it, enough for 10 people instead of 4. He laid everything out on the rooftop, looked at it again, and realized it didn't look like any meal a normal person would prepare, but he had made it with his own hands, every dish. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Reed came down to the first floor and said to Gemma and the 2 girls, "Go up to the 3rd floor." Darcy ran ahead, climbed the stairs, opened the rooftop door, and froze. Strings of lights stretched across the rooftop, glowing softly even though it was still daylight. A blanket lay spread in the middle of the floor, surrounded by plates of food, cups of water, and napkins. A light wind blew through, making the strings of lights sway. It looked like a small celebration, spontaneous, imperfect, but full of life. Darcy turned back to look at Reed, her eyes wide. "Daddy, did you do all this?" Reed stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking just as awkward as he had the first time he stood in the middle of the grass on the hill. He nodded. Darcy rushed over and threw her arms around him. Her small arms wrapped around Reed's waist, her face pressed into his shirt. Reed placed a hand on his daughter's head, and this time, he didn't go stiff. Blythe came up to the rooftop after them, looking around with wide eyes. She looked at the strings of lights, looked at the blanket, looked at the food, then turned to look at her father. She said nothing, but she ran into the room, took her drawing paper and box of crayons, brought them up to the rooftop, sat right down on the blanket, and began to draw. Gemma came up last. She looked at the rooftop, looked at the strings of lights, looked at the plates of overburned food and the terribly salty pasta, and had to bite her lip to keep from laughing. But her eyes were wet. The 4 of them sat on the blanket in the middle of the rooftop, eating burned roasted chicken, salty pasta, and far too much toast. Darcy chewed the pasta and grimaced. "Daddy, it's too salty." Reed looked at his daughter. "Is it really salty?" Darcy nodded rapidly. Reed tasted it, then grimaced too. Blythe looked at father and daughter and covered her mouth as she laughed. Gemma poured water for everyone, smiling. "Drink plenty of water." They ate it all, not because it was good, because Reed had made it with his own hands, and that made even the most burned dish worth eating. Blythe drew throughout the meal. When everyone was almost finished, she lifted the picture to show Reed, a portrait of her father. Version 2. The first time, on the hill, she had drawn her father standing beside the lake, with no details on his face. This time, her father was smiling. His mouth curved upward, his eyes narrowed slightly, and around him were strings of lights. Reed held the drawing, looked at it for a long time, then looked at Blythe. "Can I keep this?" Blythe nodded, her eyes bright. Afternoon sunlight covered the rooftop, and the strings of lights began to glow more clearly as the day leaned toward evening. Darcy ran around the rooftop, counting light bulbs. After running a few circles, she stopped, sat down beside Reed, leaned against her father's shoulder, and said, "Daddy, our house can be fun too." Reed heard that sentence and stopped. He looked down at his daughter leaning against his shoulder, looked at Blythe drawing a second picture on the blanket, looked at the strings of lights sparkling around the railing, looked at the plates of badly burned food that everyone had finished. For 3 years, he had turned this house into a fortress. Cameras, guards, codes, fences. He had thought a fortress was the safest place. Darcy had just reminded him, a fortress could also be a home. Gemma took out her phone and photographed father and daughters sitting together on the blanket in the middle of the rooftop. Reed was watching Blythe draw. Darcy was leaning against her father's shoulder, and the strings of lights glowed behind them. Darcy saw Gemma taking the picture and shouted, "Miss Gemma, come be in the picture too." Gemma shook her head, smiling. "I'm just taking the picture for everyone." Darcy ran over and pulled Gemma's hand. "No, you have to be in it too." Reed looked at Gemma and gave a slight nod. Gemma sat down on the blanket beside Blythe. Darcy ran back and sat between her father and Gemma. Blythe leaned against Gemma. Reed stretched out his long arm, held the phone, and for the first time in his life, Reed Kingsley took a selfie. The first photograph with all four of them in it. Late that night, Darcy fell asleep first, curled up on the blanket, her head resting on Gemma's leg. Blythe lay beside her, one hand still holding the box of crayons, her eyes slowly growing heavy before she fell asleep too. The strings of lights twinkled above them. The night wind was cool. The city shone in the distance. Reed and Gemma sat beside each other, the two sleeping children between them, on the rooftop of the mansion that for 3 years had known only silence. Reed sat still, watching his two daughters sleep on the blanket in the middle of the rooftop. Darcy was curled up, her head resting on Gemma's leg, both arms hugging the small pillow she had brought up from her room. Blythe lay on her back, the box of crayons still held against her chest, her breathing steady. The strings of lights twinkled above them, the night wind was cool, and the city glowed in the distance. Reed looked over at Gemma. She was looking down at Darcy, her hand gently stroking the little girl's hair. She didn't know Reed was looking at her. Or perhaps she knew, but didn't turn back. Reed opened his mouth, then hesitated. He was a man who could say one sentence and make a partner of 10 years leave the city. But right now, sitting on the rooftop of his own house beside this woman, he couldn't find any easy words. Then he spoke, his voice softer than Gemma had ever heard it. Stay, not as the nanny. Gemma turned to look at Reed. He was looking at her, his eyes no longer cold, no longer controlling, no longer the eyes of Kingsley. Reed's eyes, only Reed. Gemma didn't say anything. Her eyes were red. She reached out and placed her hand on his, gently, not gripping, not squeezing, only placing it there, like an answer that needed no words. Reed looked at Gemma's hand resting on his, and he understood. In that moment, Blythe shifted in her sleep. The little girl turned toward Gemma, and her hand, still holding the box of crayons, reached out and took Gemma's hand, held it tighter, like a child holding her mother's hand in a dream. Gemma looked down at the small hand holding hers. Then she looked at Reed, the man the whole city feared, the man whose 4-minute phone call could change someone's fate. He was sitting on the rooftop of his own house, among plates of burned food, beside his two sleeping daughters, his hair a little ruffled by the wind, his t-shirt wrinkled, with no silver watch, no black suit. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't look like a powerful man. He looked like a father. The strings of lights twinkled. The wind was gentle. The city below was still lit, still moving, still filled with 4-minute phone calls that could change someone's fate, still holding envelopes sent in the night, still holding meetings in expensive restaurants where a single USB drive could end a man's career. But on this rooftop, in this moment, none of that existed. There was no Kingsley, only Reed. A man sitting beside the woman who had pulled him out of 3 years of silence, between the two daughters he had almost lost, not because of an enemy, but because of himself. And he knew, more clearly than anything he had ever known in his life, these were the people he wouldn't let himself lose ever again. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from the enemies outside, but from the distance we create ourselves from the people we love. And sometimes, the bravest thing isn't fighting, but allowing ourselves to step closer, even knowing that closeness means we can lose. If this story touched you, please hit like and share it with the people you love. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, because the best story may be waiting for you in the next video. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment sharing the emotions from deep within your heart. We're always listening to every line of your comments. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.